Hello, church history friends. Welcome, welcome. My name's Barb Walden, and it is a pleasure to welcome you this evening as we gather around to hear Janné Grover share her story. I hope you're as excited as we are about tonight's program. But before we dive into things, I want to tell you about the latest church history happenings here at the Historic Sites Foundation. Peter Smith and I are taking to the road and sky this September on another church history adventure. We invite you to join us this September as we explore the story of Community of Christ in Australia. We are going to visit a number of sites that are related to Community of Christ history, including what you see on the screen here, this beautiful view of Tiona. This is the Community of Christ reunion grounds in Australia, a place that we'll visit among a number of Community of Christ sites as we explore this part of the world. To learn more about this tour, Wendy is dropping a link into the chat, and I encourage you to check out the tour webpage that's on the Foundation's website, where you can find more details out about this tour. The last I heard, there were only 3 seats left available, so be sure to jump on that quickly. And speaking of Community of Christ history, we have a great series planned for you over the next 4 weeks. Tonight kicks off the first of 4 Thursdays where we will explore a wide variety of church history topics. Tonight, Janné adds her incredible journey to our Your Story is Church History collection. It's going to be a great way to kick off this series. Well, next week we will welcome Seth Bryant as he shares the story of Isaac Sheen in a lecture called Disillusionment in Nauvoo, the Isaac Sheen Experience. Friends, if you're not familiar with the name Isaac Sheen or the story behind Sheen, I encourage you to join us next week because it is a fascinating story. A story about someone who grew up in poverty in England, travels here to the United States, um, becomes a Quaker and a radical abolitionist, eventually joins the reorganization and becomes a significant leader in the reorganization. And there's so much more to Isaac Sheen's story. So I encourage you to join us next Thursday as we hear more about this historic individual from Seth Bryant. The week following that, on May 14th, I have the joy of sharing the story of RLDS apostle James E. Kelly. And then finally, on the last Thursday of the series, we welcome Kristen Mackay to share the 100th year story, 100 years of history behind the historic auditorium in Independence, Missouri. It's definitely a lecture you don't want to miss. Wendy is dropping a link into the chat where you can go to register for any or all of the upcoming lectures. Lastly, none of this would be possible without your generosity. None of the tours or online programs could be possible without you. Thank you all so much for your generous donations and monthly gifts throughout the year. If anybody would like to give this evening, there are 3 easy ways to give to support the Historic Sites Foundation through online giving and gifts through the mail. And you can read more about it on the screen here. Wendy will drop the online link in the chat for those wishing to make an online donation tonight. Well, friends, we know there are a lot of outstanding educational organizations that you are giving to and supporting, and we thank you for thinking of us when you turn to organizations that you wish to support. Thank you so much for your generosity. Now, there are 2 people joining me tonight who really need no introduction, but if you're new this evening, allow me to introduce you to Wendy Eaton and Peter Smith. Wendy is our administrative assistant for the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation and a co-host for the popular podcast Cup of Joe, which is sponsored by the Faith Unfiltered podcast. So welcome, Wendy. Thank you for joining us tonight. Peter is a board member for the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation and co-host of our annual church history tours. Welcome also to Peter. I'm so glad you're here. It's good to have both of you back for another round of church history lectures. this spring. The last introduction tonight is a very special one. Our guest speaker, or better yet, our guest storyteller this evening, is the one and only Janné Grover. Janné is a member of the First Presidency and counselor to Community of Christ President Prophet Stassi Cramm. Janné is passionate about lifelong learning, the power of music and communal singing, and the variety of ways in which spiritual community forms and faithfully responds in Christ's mission. Previous church employment includes service in the Council of 12 Apostles, Director of Formation Ministries, Disciple Formation Specialist, and Daily Prayer for Peace Coordinator. Well, before church employment, Janné served as a high school and middle school band and orchestra teacher, then enjoyed dedicated time at home with her 3 children. Janné earned a Master of Arts in Religion from Graceland University and Community of Christ Seminary, an education specialist in secondary administration and superintendency from Northwest Missouri State University, a Master of Arts in Instrumental Conducting from Florida State University, and a Bachelor of Science in Music Education from the University of Missouri, Columbia. Welcome, Janné. We are so delighted that you are here to share with us this evening. I know you don't feel comfortable talking about yourself or being in the spotlight, so I am especially grateful that you agreed to reach outside of your comfort zone to share your journey with us tonight. I'll hand the microphone over to you to share as long as you'd like.
Thank you, Barb, and thank you, Peter and Wendy, for hosting and supporting this this experience and this series. So, yes, as Barb said, I am not comfortable just talking about myself, and so this is kind of an interesting experience. And yet there are aspects of my story that I hope all of you will recognize or find yourselves in my story. Sometimes I feel like I don't have a lot of things, very many interesting things to share. And yet, I think for all of us, it is important for us to share our stories with one another, to share how our lives are impacted by the love of God, by the mission of Jesus Christ, by the Spirit that connects us in community. So I have profound gratitude for the tapestry of our stories woven together in this sacred journey that we share. And again, in my story may be pieces of your story. In fact, as I was scrolling through the participants list as I could see it, I didn't see everyone, but I saw many people that are in my story, and I am grateful. But the beauty is in our shared and collective story and in our journey of becoming. So I am going to share my screen. We practiced this, so I know it will work. So thank you, Barb. I'm glad to know that it is working. So you'll notice a music score in the background of all of my slides. And that is important because music has been such an important part of my formation, of my story, of part of my career, my original career. And also I'm going to weave that in at the end to how it continues to inform my story as a church leader in the First Presidency. So I've kind of shaped my story and the way I'm sharing it in some movements in becoming. So you will recognize some music terms that I have chosen as the different movements in my story. So we will begin with the prelude. So, my story with the church connection begins with my great grandparents, Andrew and Carrie Jensen. So a couple of years ago, I did a Storyworth project with my mom, and it's a way of capturing somebody's stories, responding to different questions, and so I was grateful to be able to draw from some of the work that my mom had already done in her story to share where this story of mine begins. So I'm going to read a paragraph from her book, and she draws this from her aunt, May Rowlett. So Andrew Jensen was born in Denmark, May 3rd of 1854, and he was married to Karen Marie Peterson on February 29th, 1877. They united with the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the summer of 1877 during a mission of H.N. Hansen to his native country. The couple came to America in 1877 to seek social and religious liberty. They located on a farm in Nottoway County in the area that is known as Bettison. And several families from Denmark and Sweden had begun locating about 3 miles southeast of Bettison around the year 1870. The families of Ole Madison, Rasmus Lorentzen, Hans Freud, Nels Hansen, and Jacob Hansen located in this community of saints. So my great-grandfather Andrew was a musician in Denmark, but when he settled in the area of Bettison and established a farm, he became a Midwest United States farmer, and so that was quite an adjustment for him. This is my maternal great-grandparents. And my grandpa is in the middle of this picture, who is my mom's dad, Raymond Jensen. So this is my dad's family, and his family connected with the church sometime before his grandparents, my great-grandparents, ended up in Spokane, Washington. I have not done a Storyworth project with my dad yet, so I don't have all of the details of that story the same way that I have for my mom's. But because of that connection to the church, my grandma, Irene, in this picture, sent her 3 boys up the hill in Spokane to the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that is where they began a connection with the church for my dad's family. And his family joined the church when he was 11. So that is my dad's family, and this is my mom, is the farmer's only daughter, and this is a picture of her with my grandparents in their home in Bettison in Northwest Missouri. So my parents met and married while they were at Graceland College at that time. And their first date was to prayer service. And that reflects the strong roots of faith and the humble servant ministry that has been a foundation for our family. And I am grateful for that foundation. Some of the lessons that I learned from my grandmothers. From my Grandma Jensen, the gift of hospitality was unmatched. The table that was in my Grandma Jensen's kitchen, around which so many people gathered for conversation and good food, is now the table that is in my kitchen. And I often think about how many lives have been nurtured around that table, and it is precious to me. I also learned from my Grandma Jensen the importance of showing up. Now, when I was little, we were drug all over the the county, it seemed like, visiting homes and visiting friends, visiting people in different locations, but visiting was a popular thing. And sometimes I would really be antsy uh, to be finished with the visiting. And often we would have to drag our violins and play as well. But those experiences are a reminder of the value of being present to your community. So neither of my grandmothers held a priesthood office, but they served faithfully in ministry to their communities and to their families. And these are foundations that are precious to me as well. From my grandma Collins, I attribute her for my love of word games. So Scrabble is my favorite game, and I loved playing Scrabble with my grandma. Not very many people in my family like to play Scrabble, but occasionally I can talk them into playing. But I love word games, and that was something that I shared with my grandma. I also value from her the gift of writing. She would give us stamps in our stockings for Christmas to encourage us to write letters. And it was always important for her to encourage that writing for all of us. And it is something that I have enjoyed developing over the years. I was very proud of my grandma Collins because she was a published author. And by that I mean her writings were in the Daily Bread. So because that was a published book, that was something that I thought was pretty impressive. But she wrote every morning as part of her spiritual practice, and she had reflections that were published in the Daily Bread. And she also wrote a lot of poetry. She had a dream of setting one of her poems to music that would be impactful, something like Silent Night. And so I set one of her poems to a hymn tune as a tribute to her in honor of her writing and her dream of having her poetry set to music. So that is some of the beginnings of my story. Part of the prelude. The exposition in a sonata form is where the themes are introduced. And so as my story unfolds, we see some important themes that are introduced here. So I was born into an awareness of God's love. And perhaps that is the most profound foundation of my becoming. I recognize this as a blessing and privilege that is precious to me, and I try not to take it for granted. I say that I was born into an awareness of God's love, and that is because of my parents who expressed that love to me, to my family, and to their community. I also recognize being born into an awareness of God's love through the community that surrounded me and continues to surround me as part of my becoming. This picture, I had to ask my mom who was holding me because I didn't recognize the person that is holding me, but I believe, and I didn't write it down, and now I've forgotten the person's name. But the person on the left who is blessing me is my grandpa Jensen. And so all of the sacraments that mark my life journey are incredibly precious to me, an important part of the formation of my discipleship, of who I am as a person, who I am as a minister, as a mother, as a wife, and as a child of God. I began music lesson. Oh, excuse me. Before we get to music lessons, I was born in Bedison, so we lived in the country near Maryville. So Bedison is a rural community that is near Maryville, Missouri. But when I was 2, we moved to Salt Lake City. So this is a picture of my nuclear family: my mom and dad, Gary and Ramona Collins, and my sister in the middle is my older sister, Jerry, and my brother, Brad, on the right. And I am the one on the left with the curls. And this is when we lived in Salt Lake City, Utah, which is where we lived for a year while my dad did his PhD. We then moved to Ottawa, Kansas, where my dad was teaching at Ottawa University. And this is where I began music lessons. So this is about the age of 4, and Ottawa, Kansas remains a hotbed for Suzuki technique. So if you're familiar with the Suzuki program, it was really big in the early 70s especially. And so I learned violin starting with the Suzuki method when I was 4 years old, and this was in Ottawa, Kansas. And then we moved to Lamoni, Iowa. So my early elementary years were spent in Lamoni. And I don't have a picture, I didn't have a picture handy from my baptism, but I was baptized in Lamoni. I remember at the age of 7 telling my mom that I needed to start my pre-baptismal classes because I needed to be ready so I could be baptized at the age of 8. I've shared this story often, and I often ask, what do you think I was most excited about in being baptized? And the answer is typically communion. That is typically what people are excited about, or children are excited about. But for me, I was excited about my first business meeting. And I could not wait to be baptized so that I could be part of a business meeting. And I remember my first business meeting, and I don't remember what we were voting on, but I remember that my dad was presiding. And when it came time to vote, he looked right at me and counted my vote. There was something very special about being counted or being heard in that way, and sharing as part of that experience. But it was also a glimpse that I was part of something bigger. And I had no idea what that meant at the time. But my journey of becoming has been an ongoing discovery about what that something bigger is. So since I couldn't access my a picture from my baptism, I included this picture, which is me presiding at my first World Conference business meeting. So 8-year-old Janné was so excited about a business meeting. And 8-year-old Janné was having a moment the first time that I was in the chair at World Conference. If you were at World Conference, you will remember that everything that could have happened happened. We had technical difficulties with the translations. The whole lectern system went down, and we had to evacuate because to the lower assembly because of a tornado. So all of that, I thought it was appropriate to include this picture as a representation of the something bigger, not because of where I'm standing, but because of what it means for us to be a community that discerns together. That is part that all of us are part of that something bigger. And that process of hearing one another, of voices being heard as part of a process where there are differences of perspectives and experiences, learning from one another, hearing one another, discerning together, and deciding together on the future of the church is a precious, sacred thing. And it's something that I hope that we never take for granted. That's just one example of the something bigger, but it is certainly um, an experience for all of us that is important to remember that while we live out our discipleship in a local context, we are connected to this global vision of peace and justice in Christ's mission. So my formative years, then that was Lamoni, Iowa, where we lived for my early elementary years. My formative years were spent on the farm in Bedison near Maryville, Missouri. You'll see the big M on the my uniform on the left side of the screen. So these are pictures of my family from my formative years. I I love that I lived on a farm, and many of the experiences were very valuable to me from that experience. But I have to say, I was probably the least productive farm hand, so to speak. So that's kind of a joke in our family. My sister and I were hired to do some chores. The worst chore on the farm, I think, is walking beans, and we were hired to do that for for my dad or for my grandpa, and we were very unproductive in that effort. We spent a lot of time going back to my grandma's house for snacks. But I do value the lessons learned of a strong work ethic and the importance of tending to the land, tending to creatures, and the animals that were part of our stewardship. All of that was an important part of my formation. So part of the music lessons were very important in our family. So you will see, and I was joking with Barb and Peter and Wendy before we before we started this webinar that this page seems like I just found all the most awkward pictures of my youth and put them on a slide, and that's what you have. But you see, my favorite part of the farm was that we had horses, and I loved horses. You will also notice that my siblings and I were all involved in music. That was very important to our family. And so music lessons were encouraged from a very early age. So I started violin at the age of 4. Violin was never my natural instrument. I took lessons for 10 years and I can still play the violin, but it was never a natural instrument for me. But my daughter picked up the violin and just made it sing. And so it is very natural for her. But piano and saxophone are my primary instruments that I focused on. And in these years, these formative years, we attended the congregation of Bedison that was out in the country. And I had opportunity. That's where I learned to be a music minister. And that was a really important lesson that it was not just about playing music or accompanying hymns, but there was more to it of being a music minister. And I had some wonderful mentors. My mom is a pianist, and she encouraged me and supported me and mentored me in that. But also, Fran Gabrielson was a piano player and a dear friend in the congregation of Bedison. And she is the one that really began teaching me what it meant to be a music minister, um, how to think about leading music from the piano, how to think about choosing what to play, how to think about the flow of a worship experience. And so I really value that mentoring as part of my developing. So I was taking music lessons and improving my skills, but there's also something that needs to be nurtured in learning to be a music minister, and I'm really grateful for that. So I think about so many lessons that I learned on the farm, that I learned from my parents. And that some of those lessons are the importance of family and faith, the importance of prayer. Oftentimes, um, if there was a concern or a question or um, something that was stressful, my dad always encouraged me to go to prayer. I mentioned that on the farm, but also in the nature of who my parents are and what they encouraged in us was a very strong work ethic and the value of education, the value of music, the importance of play. This is something that we did often, whether it was inside around a table, a board game, or outside, the importance of play. We were involved in, my dad was involved with athletics, and we had opportunity to be involved in sports, but there's a difference between being involved in sports, which is learning a game, learning skills, and being part of a team. But the importance of play is something that I hope that we see as something very different. It's part of the practice of Sabbath. That is not something that we talked about when I was young, but the importance of play is part of the practice of Sabbath. That is not just rest in terms of how we might traditionally think of rest, but also the importance of play and this idea of delighting. It's always tricky when you are trying to play and uphold the importance of play when you're surrounded by competitive people. And that's what I find in my family now sometimes. But that was something that was valued for us, whether it was in our travels or just in our time at home together. It was also very important, and there were no questions asked about this, that we were in church every time the doors were open. I don't recall, maybe one time I may have been grumpy about not wanting to go to church, but it wasn't just that we didn't, but that it wasn't questionable in our family, but that was something that was important to all of us. I am very, I appreciate and value greatly the community of that Bedison congregation that was part of my extended family and such an important part of my becoming. So in the top right hand corner, you'll see a picture of my parents and my sister and I on Mizzou Parents Weekend. So when I graduated from Maryville High School, I always and only planned to go to Graceland University. That's where my parents went. That's where my sister went. My brother, who is younger than me, went to Graceland. All of our kids have gone to Graceland. That was where I was always going to go. But I made a last minute decision, a late decision, to go to the University of Missouri in Columbia. And that was a wonderful experience. And that opened all sorts of opportunities for me. And I value that experience. I do have to say that I have always lived with this tinge of regret that I did not have that Graceland experience. So, this is a plug for Graceland because I very much value the community that is part of the Graceland experience and the focus on the importance of community. And I value that that's where part of my story began. But I studied music education at the University of Missouri, and that's where I received my bachelor's degree. I was part of the Columbia congregation there, and so many people in that congregation were wonderfully supportive of me in my studies, but also in providing opportunities for ministry, for music ministry, and for other forms of ministry within the congregation. So I really value those relationships that formed during that time and some that still continue today. Um, I think I send a text to Jamie Varvero every year at Spec and say thank you. And if I neglect to do so, I always intend to. But there is often a time at Spec when we're encouraged to text somebody that we are grateful for. And Jamie is involved with the Spec directors team and also is a valued friend. That I met while I was at MU, and he and Janelle were wonderful support and encouragers of mine, and I value our relationships that continue. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. And part of this, when I went into the University of Missouri, I went in with the intent of being a music major, and I stuck with that the all 4 years. I always and only wanted to be a music teacher. That's all I ever wanted to be. I guess there was one moment in seventh grade where I thought about being a math teacher, but being a music teacher is really where my heart and passion was. So when I graduated from the University of Missouri, I taught for 2 years as a band director in Harrisonville, Missouri. And it's interesting, all of these congregations that I have been connected in have been part of the original field that I served in as an apostle. But Harrisonville was where I started teaching. Um, and I taught middle school and high school band. And as I became a teacher, I I grew into an awareness that it wasn't just about who I was forming, but how I was being formed through that experience. So the teaching learning was definitely something that resonated with me early on in my teaching career. After 2 years of teaching is when I went to Florida State uh, to do my master's in conducting. And this was a time in my life as a young adult that I began that I would classify myself as a seeker. Not because I was wanting to leave the church and seek another church necessarily, but it was part of that. Maybe some of it was a little bit of young adult rebellion, but some of it was also um, wanting to wanting to understand my faith, wanting to claim a faith that was mine, not just one that I had grown up in and experienced my whole life, but what was it to me? Where was my place in this faith journey? So there was a lot to this time of seeking and just seeking my own sense of meaning in faith, and the community was always something that was so important to me. Everywhere that I moved, especially as a young adult, It was connecting with a local congregation and having that sense of home, of family. So I tell this story also often. And so some of my stories I feel like people have heard over and over. But when I was at Florida State, the first summer that I was there was a Florida Bandmasters convention. And so I was a graduate assistant in the band department. And all of the graduate assistants were going to this Florida Bandmasters convention in a different city. And I was the only female. All the guys could share a room, and so their cost was considerably less. And I was going to have to get a room by myself, and that was going to be really expensive. And so my mom got me connected with the district president, who was just lost his name, but it'll come Jim Slaughter. Jim Slaughter was the district president, and he was a good friend of ours from Lamoni. So we got connected. I called Jim. Jim said, I'll call the pastor. I'll get you connected. So got connected with the pastor, who said, we will come and pick you up. You will stay in our home. And so my colleagues, the other graduate assistants, could not believe that I was going to go to a stranger's home, someone I had never met, and I was going to stay in a stranger's home. It was the most delightful experience. My host family, he had spent his career as a server, and so when they picked me up and brought me into their home, I had this beautiful spread of a meal, and I was tended to with the most unbelievable hospitality. And so it was hard for me to describe to my colleagues that while, yes, I had never met these people before, I didn't really feel like I was going into a stranger's home. That is part of the something bigger that being a part of, but part of the community that has always been a welcoming place and a place of home wherever I have lived. So when I left Florida State, I taught in Atlanta, Georgia, in Marietta, Georgia, for a year. And again, I was still trying to kind of find my way about my faith experience. And I wandered into the Atlanta North congregation, and I went into what I thought was the adult Sunday school class. And it ended up being Nancy Evans and one other person. And it turns out that that was an adult pre-baptismal class. And I had wandered into that class, and Nancy said, well, why don't you just stay and join us in this class, and you can be part of this experience with us. And that was a wonderful experience for me of kind of discovering my faith for myself, is going through that pre-baptismal class with another person and a wonderful spiritual companion. I had the opportunity at a women's retreat just a few weeks ago to be with Nancy and to share this story with her that she had never heard. But Nancy was an influential person for me. It was also one day in church at Atlanta North that I was just kind of just asking those questions of where do I belong in all of this, in this faith journey, in my career? Where do I belong? And Nancy passed me a note in church. And she had torn off the corner of the bulletin, and she wrote on it, there is a special spirit about you. And that simple little note passed in church had a profound impact of, in that moment, I had this recognition that perhaps there was some kind of calling for me. Now, I was 16 when Section 154 was adopted. And prior to that time, I couldn't imagine in my life the possibility of a priesthood call. I certainly understood the possibility of a priesthood call for my mom, but um, I did not recognize that potential in myself until I received that little note passed in church. And I thought that maybe that was part of my journey of becoming. So I left, I only taught in Atlanta for a year, but that was a very impactful and important year. During that time is also when the temple was completed. And when I came home one summer for some family weddings, Larry Norris took my parents and me for a tour of the temple. And I walked into the narthex of the temple and saw the wooden cross with the pieces of wood from all around the world. And I recognized in that space the something bigger that I was a part of. I found what I was looking for. I felt that I was home. This calling to be a people of peace, this temple dedicated to the pursuit of peace and reconciliation and healing of the spirit, became the pivotal moment in my discipleship, in my journey. And suddenly, calling as a disciple started to take on a whole new meaning, and it was something that I was able to claim as my own. So the temple at this time was very profound in my journey of discipleship and continues to be so today. So I'm going to share my screen again um, and move past all the awkward pictures. As I said, all I wanted to be was a music teacher. And so I moved from Atlanta as a band director to Blue Springs as a band director. And it is there that I met my husband, Kevin Grover. And Kevin was a science teacher at Blue Springs High School, and we were introduced by mutual friends. And this was in 1994. And we were married in 1996. And my parents often say that your who you choose as your spouse is one of the most important decisions that you make in life, and I would agree. And I also am grateful for the decision that I made in marrying Kevin. So Kevin was an educator who also became a school administrator. We share administration degrees, but he is the one that served as a principal. Um, I learned a lot from my degrees, but never served as a school administrator. Kevin has now retired and is serving on the admissions team with Graceland University. And so he is celebrating every time he gets another confirmed commit to Graceland University. So I taught in Blue Springs for a couple years. I opened one of the new middle schools at the time. And then I moved to Lee Summit High School as a band director, but eventually ended up at Lee Summit North High School as an orchestra director. And the picture that is on the screen of me conducting was at Carnegie Hall. And so I had an opportunity to go with a couple of groups. I actually went with the Messiah Choir that sang at Carnegie Hall. And I had the opportunity to conduct a couple of groups. But this performance in particular was my high school orchestra that performed at Carnegie Hall. That job seemed like my dream job. I fell in love with the orchestra. There is something about the sound of the winds and percussion as it comes through the strings instruments that is just incredible. It changes the sound even of wind instruments a little. But the way that it blends, the sound, the literature, everything about the orchestra, I fell in love. But at that same time was also when I got my other dream job, which was becoming a mom. And so these are our three babies. Zach is in the yellow. He is our oldest. He is now 26 and married to Erin Tinsman. Dylan is in the blue shirt and he is 24 and he is doing his master's in athletic training at University of Central Missouri. And our daughter Caitlin is in the middle and she just finished her junior year at Graceland University. So, like I said, all of these, my dream jobs were happening at the same time. But I found that I was having I was feeling like I was not able to excel in both of my dream jobs. And so Kevin and I made a very difficult decision, and I stepped away from teaching to be home with the kids. At the time, we just had the boys, but Caitlin then came shortly after that. But this time that I stayed home with the kids, I also had the opportunity to watch my sister's three kids, which are all the same age, and I taught all my nieces and nephews piano lessons, and I had some other private students. That time that I was staying at home, um, I really I wasn't prepared for the grief of leaving teaching. I felt like I was also leaving part of a mission field, this opportunity for ministry as part of teaching. But it is also at this time that I responded to a call to serve in priesthood, and began to immerse myself in all the aspects of congregational life. So our children were raised by the community of Woods Chapel. The Woods Chapel congregation is where our family it's where Kevin and I were married, and it's where our family has grown up. And I am so grateful for that community. So many spiritual companions to me, to Kevin, to our kids. It was a profound blessing to our family. But I began to pour myself into ministry and mission opportunities in different ways, all aspects of congregation life. We were present and have been every time the doors are open, and all sorts of different kinds of activities, enjoying house church, small group ministries, all so profound as part of my development, but also for my whole family. And so I was home for about 7 years with the kids. And after Caitlin went to kindergarten, a friend of mine who was working in the community communications department at International Headquarters said there's a part-time position for a daily prayer for peace coordinator. So I said, well, that sounds like a great opportunity in about a year. So let me know if something like that opens up in a year. Then a few months later, she said, well, it's still open, and so you really need to apply. And I said, well, maybe in a few months, that would be really great. So a few months later, I was up at the temple, and she basically said, I'm going to walk this down to HR, so you can come and sign it if you want to, but you need to apply for this. So I became the part-time, it was a part-time position, but it was the Daily Prayer for Peace coordinator. And this was also a really impactful experience for me. As I helped shape services for each day, but also learning about the countries that we prayed for, and learning about different experiences, gathering prayers from around the world, meeting people from different places as they came in and visited and participated in the prayer for peace. My kids loved to go up and put the pins for the countries that we would be praying for throughout the week. My son Zach thought it was pretty cool that he stumped his 7th grade geography teacher because he knew the country Nauru, and his teacher did not know that country. So it was kind of a fun family experience, but it was also a really important aspect of learning what it meant to be a global citizen, and also what it meant to pray and work for peace in the world. So even though the format of the daily prayer for peace has shifted, we still pray for peace in the temple, but the prayer for peace has also become part of the DNA of who we are as a worshiping community. And I really value that. That is part of the heart of our worship, is praying for peace and opening ourselves to the conditions of the world in which we live and where we can serve and work for peace. So that was in 2011, and then I transitioned into full-time employment as a disciple formation specialist. And that passion for all that forms us as disciples and as communities was really developed and enhanced during that time. Um, I also started seminary as part of when I was working as a disciple formation specialist, which was an incredibly profound experience. And I noticed some of my fellow students in seminary were on the participants list. So, Lou, it's always good to see you and think about our journey together in seminary. As I was nearing the end of seminary, was also after we had launched the Community of Christ Sings hymnal. I was not part of the hymnal steering team, but I had been involved with some of the review projects as part of the hymnal process, the development of it. But in 2014, Jan Crable was supposed to go to Africa to do the hymnal launch, but she was not able to go. And so Jane Gardner asked if I would be willing to go. So I had not done a hymnal launch, and I had not been to Africa. And I traveled, and it ended up being, this whole trip became my final project for a seminary. And so it was a 3.5 week trip to Africa. And it was an incredibly transforming experience for me. And this picture on the left is from our trip started out with an IYF in Zambia. And there's me and my colleague Bunda as part of the IYF. And then I did Mission Center conferences and hymnal launches in Zambia and Malawi and Kenya. And so that was my first international trip, and I was just blown away with experiencing the church in different cultures and contexts. I was amazed at the young people who gathered at the IYF and the things that the insight and the wisdom that they had in our experience together. The way that they sang and the way that they danced with their music, I recognized it in every place that I went as this full body spirituality. And I loved it. I still love it. It was so different than the way that I typically would worship or sing, but it was something that just embraced and enveloped me. And I began to claim that as part of my something bigger and part of my becoming. So shortly after that, that was my first trip, and I've had a number of trips to French Polynesia, to Dominican Republic, to Africa several times. And in fact, just in 2024, so 10 years after this first IYF, I had the opportunity to go back and do a training with leaders, and a number of the youth that had been at the IYF are now incredible emerging and critical leaders in the life of the church in Africa, and that was really exciting to experience. But in 2016, that was a very difficult time in the life of the church. We were going through a significant financial downsizing and a financial crisis in the church. But this was the time that Steve Veazey stopped by my office and asked if I had a minute and presented the call for me to serve in the Council of 12 Apostles. And so this this picture on the right, I love this picture, although I regret that we're missing two of the members of the 12 at that time. Ron Harmon and Carlos Enrique Mejia were not able to be in that picture. But I love this picture of my colleagues in the 12 in front of the peace doors at the temple. And we were recording a Prayer for Peace segment that was used as a video, and it was used at World Conference. I loved the community of the Council of 12. I loved the experience of this community of shared calling to be apostles of Christ's peace. And I loved the connections with the field. And so, over the course of 9 years, as I served on the Council of 12, I deeply valued and appreciated the fact that I was only whole as a minister, as an apostle of Christ's peace, as I was part of that diverse council. So I recognized my wholeness was in our shared journey of calling, in the context that we all brought together, that influenced each of us in our ministry, that influenced the church as we learned from one another, as we discerned for the well-being of the church and developed strategies for mission. It was 9 years of a lot of challenges in the life of the church. But through that experience, I was also incredibly grateful for the faithful response of so many, for the generosity that continues, that as we think, it's easy to be consumed by a scarcity feeling in the world, or that there's not enough, or we're not enough. But everywhere I went was an outpouring of generosity. Generosity not just in funding budgets and tithing, but in how people showed up in community and continued to show up and tend to one another, continued to be compelled by the mission of Christ that calls us beyond the walls and beyond the forms of our gathering, to walk with, to learn with, to serve with, and for the communities beyond. This is where the Spirit is calling us to be new communities of Christ's peace. And so I did not want to leave the Council of 12. And I miss my colleagues, but I responded to the call to serve in the presidency and was ordained at this last World Conference in 2025. And this is my favorite picture of the presidency. I love that we are wearing our For All shirts, and I love how it captures Bunda's smile, but I love how it captures the joy of the World Conference experience. I also recognize this is a picture of our family. I refer to us as Team Grover. This was right after my ordination. Something that I discovered as part of when I was presented with a call to serve in the Council of 12. Our family was quite a bit younger at that time, and I wasn't sure how I could respond. I felt the sense I had been journeying with a sense of something. And so I had a feeling of that call, and I sensed that call and wanted to serve when it was presented, but I could not reconcile how I could choose the calling over the needs of my family. And so one night I went to bed and I was grieving because I thought I'm going to have to tell President Veazey at the time that I cannot serve at this time. But the next morning, I woke up with a bit of clarity, and I recognized that this was not my calling alone, that I needed to bring my whole family, the kids, into this experience. And that if we could be all together in this call, then I could serve as an apostle. And so when we presented this, I had been discerning with Kevin, but when we shared it with the kids, the first response was Zach. And he said, Mom, you have to do this. This is important. And then my son Dylan said, Do I have to call you John the mom now? We've never established that as something that he needed to do. Caitlin took a little bit of just questioning, what does this mean? But the whole family has been so incredibly supportive. And it was important for me as I stepped into this role now in the presidency that I continue to have their support, but not just their support, that I do feel that this is a shared journey of calling and response in the life of the church. I'm grateful for their wisdom, all that I learned from them about curiosity, about accountability, about justice and peace, and about inclusion. So this idea of Ubuntu, which I learned from my African brothers and sisters, that I am because we are, is how I feel about my family, how I feel about this church family that is spread across the globe. I believe that there is such great power as we learn, as we lean into and embrace the reality that in the well being of all is our individual reality. And there is such power and potential in that as we faithfully respond to that. So I'm going to bring it back now to this whole conducting and music piece that is still very important for me. When I was called into the 12, I was given a gift from Jim Hanna, and it was a picture of a conductor in front of a big, large music note. And the picture is in my office at the temple, and it is special to me because of the gift from Jim and Sharon Hanna. But it also came with an article talking about the importance of the conductor and how that connects with being a spiritual leader. So a conductor serves the music, the musicians, and the audience. So it is important for the conductor to interpret faithfully the music and to empower and help balance the musicians in the group and to serve the audience by what is presented. And so I feel like that transfers significantly as I think about my role as a spiritual, as a leader in the First Presidency. And that is that, first of all, I am called to serve the gospel. And so I am called to faithfully interpret scripture, to listen, to balance the voices across the church, to empower leaders and disciples, to know when we have to make adjustments to make sure that we are responding and interpreting faithfully together. And then ultimately, that is to serve the world in which we live more broadly. That we are a gift and a blessing to the whole of creation as we respond in the mission of Christ. So, all of the music metaphors, all of the story of my becoming, I hope a lesson that is a takeaway is that your story is never finished. It's never fully written. And your song is never sung and finished. It is always open to becoming. So I hope that as maybe you have seen some of your story in my story, um, I hope that you are also open to where the Spirit is leading you to become. And as some of my colleagues have referred to me as being irritatingly hopeful, I will say in closing to my story that it may be irritating, but it is authentic. I am hopeful because of this story that claims us and calls us forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Janné. Um, Thank you so much for sharing your unique story and journey with us tonight. I really, really didn't want it to end. There has been so many wonderful comments made in the chat, and we will be sure to record that chat and send it to you if you haven't had the chance to read everything that so many of your friends and family have shared tonight. Our evening has flown by, and I'm sorry that it's time to draw our time to a close. Thank you so much, Janné, for serving as our storyteller this evening and for sharing your story with us. It's been a wonderful way to kick off the spring lecture series. Also, a big thank you to Peter and Wendy for helping out behind the scenes and always making things look so easy. We also want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us tonight, for your continuing interest in church history and love of a good story, and for your generous support for the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. We really couldn't host programs like tonight without your support. Thank you so very, very much. We hope you will join us next week, next Thursday, as we welcome Seth Bryant to the lecture series. Seth will share a lecture called Disillusionment in Nauvoo, the Isaac Sheen Experience. I'm especially excited about this lecture. For those of you who may not be familiar with Isaac Sheen, you're definitely not alone. Sheen was an early member of the church in the 1840s Nauvoo period who went on to become an influential leader in the early reorganization. His early years are truly fascinating as he experienced poverty growing up in England and immigrated to the United States, becoming a Quaker and a radical abolitionist. It's a fascinating story. Seth will dive into all of these details during next week's lecture, along with Sheen's rocky experience living near Nauvoo, Illinois, and why he decided to head east after the death of Joseph and Hiram Smith. Wendy has already dropped the link in the chat where you can be among the first to register for next Thursday's program. So thanks again for joining us this evening. Until next time, keep reading your church history and do take care, friends. Good night.